Hi, my name is Sergey Levine, and today I'm going to talk about the bitterest of lessons, the role of data and optimization in emergence. Let me start with a little video. This is a demo that we recorded at Google at this point about half a year or so ago, where we designed a system that could follow language commands and then enable a robot to use a variety of motor skills to then execute those commands in fairly sophisticated ways. So a user could give a complex instruction like I spilled my Coke on the table, how would you throw it away and bring me something to clean? And then the robot figures out the steps that are necessary to complete this task and uses its learned motor skills to actually perform those steps. Now, this kind of demo, of course, can be quite exciting because you can see some sort of reasoning capabilities emerge, the ability to actually understand the world around it. This is leveraging large language models together with elements of reinforcement learning and imitation learning. But oftentimes when we put together systems that can complete complex tasks like this, every step of the way we have to design the particular skills, put together all the system components necessary to do it. And in the end, typically we're pretty happy if the system does kind of what we expect. Like, we know it has the skills to pick up a sponge. We know it has the skills to move over to the counter. And if it can figure out the problem that we set for it, we consider that a success. But in many cases in artificial intelligence research, the most exciting things that we could see are emergent capabilities, when a system solves a task in a way that we didn't entirely expect. And, this happens here to some degree, in that, well, maybe bringing the sponge is not the most obvious way to clean up the spill, but it's a reasonable one. But, of course, we could imagine much more radical examples of emergence. And that's what I'm going to talk about in this talk. So it's generally considered that optimization is one of the key components to emergence. Roughly speaking, the basic idea is that you can formulate some kind of objective for a physical system. Like, maybe your physical system is a humanoid robot, perhaps in simulation. And your objective quantifies something that you'd like to see. Maybe you'd like it to figure out how to run forward. So you formulate this objective that says, for all the states and actions, you should maximize how fast you go. Now, of course, if you just optimize this objective directly with respect to all the states and actions of the system, it might not solve the problem in a particularly interesting way. It might, for example, just set a very high forward velocity and fly forward, and that's not very interesting. So typically we wouldn't call that an emergent behavior. To get more interesting emergence, you would combine that with some sort of constraint. Basically, you would say, well, maximize this objective while also obeying, let's say, the simulated laws of physics. And mediated by these laws of physics, now your optimizer might discover a solution that is actually interesting. And that is perhaps something that we would call emergence. And this is a very old idea. This is a video from 1994 by Carl Sims showing how optimization, in this case evolutionary algorithms, could enable these virtual creatures to discover various gates. And here, this optimizer is optimizing over both the morphology and the behavior itself. And you can see that it discovers some funny gates with two legs, three legs, and so on. Now, of course, this is older work. These things have come a long way. So if we go back about 10 years, this is a demo from Yuval Tassa showing a gradient-based optimizer based on model predictive control. And here you can see the emergence of locomotion skills and standing up and things like that. And that's also kind of getting more sophisticated, many more degrees of freedom, and also behaviors that are, arguably more naturalistic. And to some degree, this kind of thing works at scale. At smaller scales, we can optimize very basic controllers, feedback controllers, linear feedback in the case of MPC. If we want to take this to a larger scale and use neural networks, typically the tool of choice would be reinforcement learning. And reinforcement learning is really just the same idea, but instantiated in a slightly different way. So in reinforcement learning, you have an agent that interacts with an environment, uses that interaction to improve its controller or policy, and then repeats the process. The interaction with the environment is what encodes that constraint that you should obey the laws of physics. So the agent is only allowed to do those things that the environment permits, meaning that the environment, once again, mediates the interaction. And the agent has some goal that it's trying to fulfill through that interaction. So even though reinforcement learning is typically presented as a very different sort of thing to, for example, constrained optimization in model predictive control, at some very high level, it's a very similar concept in that there's a physical system mediating the maximization of some performance measure. And of course, with reinforcement learning, we can scale this up. We can have, for example, a neural net policy that beats the world champion at Go. And not only does it beat the world champion, but it actually discovers behaviors that people didn't expect. So this is a screenshot of two commentators analyzing the so-called move 37 in the AlphaGo versus Lee Sedol match, where AlphaGo discovered a move that people found surprising, that they didn't actually expect the system to make, and that human players perhaps wouldn't have made. They can discover strategies for playing Atari games. This is, at this point, something that every student in my deep reinforcement learning class implements as part of their homework assignment. But it's kind of an interesting example of emergent behavior where the controller playing this video game discovers a strategy where you can bounce the ball to the top and break out and break lots of bricks. And this is an example that maybe not as many people might be familiar with. This is from work by Kathy Wu, who is now a professor at MIT, used to be a PhD student at UC Berkeley, where she's studying traffic control. So this is a kind of simplified traffic control scenario. This is a simulation as if these were all kind of human drivers, and you can see that what happens, more or less what you expect, they kind of bunch up at this intersection and cause a traffic jam. And now what Kathy did is she injected one autonomous vehicle into the mix with the objective to regulate traffic so that everybody keeps flowing. And the red vehicle here is the autonomous vehicle, and you can see that the emergent behavior that it produces is one where all the vehicles kind of line up with just the right spacing so that they can pass through the intersection in time and prevent a traffic jam. So these are all examples of emergent behavior enabled through optimization, very much like on the previous slide, but now with this kind of modernized, scaled up framework of reinforcement learning. But what about the real world? So far all the examples I showed of these optimization successes were in simulated settings, and in particular settings where we know the rules perfectly. We know exactly what the rules of Go are. For that traffic simulator, we know exactly the equations of motion. Simulation, of course, is limiting. Only things that are actually simulated can support emergent behavior. If you'd like to discover, let's say, emergent behavior for how to fold laundry super quickly by throwing it up in the air, well, you need a world that actually has those physical phenomena. Video games have fairly limited physics. Certainly the emergent creatures don't simulate all the nuances of the physical world. And the game of Go is, though it's a complex game, is governed by a very simple set of rules. The more complex your environment is, the more intelligence you should need to succeed in it. What would be the equivalent of, move 37 for a physical environment? Could a robot figure out how to hack physics and perform a task in some really impressive way that we didn't expect? Perhaps it could, but to do that it needs to be situated in the real world. So the more complex your environment is, the more intelligence you should need to succeed in it, right? Which means that if you have real physics, object interactions, the broad variety of situations that you discover in nature, multi-agent interactions with other humans and animals, perhaps there's a lot more that you could do there. But we haven't seen as much in the way of reinforcement learning in these settings. In fact, there's actually an enormous gulf in the kind of complexity of environments in which the RL methods have produced this kind of emergent behavior. So what's up with that? Well, the trouble really is with models. So I mentioned that this emergence occurs when maximization of some objective is mediated by some kind of physical constraint. And in reinforcement learning, that's imposed by the fact that the agent is interacting with an environment. And that environment typically would be a simulator. Certainly for the game of Go, it would be playing games against itself in a simulator. So the classic simulated reinforcement learning approach looks like this. So we could ask, well, why can't we just train this in the real world directly? Instead of having the agent interact with a simulator, why can't it interact with the real world? And to some degree it can, right? So you could actually run RL in the real world, collect data, train, and iterate. But doing this naively, directly running the kinds of algorithms that have worked for playing video games and playing the game of Go, it's seemingly close to how humans learn, perhaps in some naive way, but it's very difficult to set up. It could be prohibitively costly if the policy is bad. You need to figure out how to evaluate your reward function, how to reset between trials. If you're going to try to teach your robot to do the dishes, well, it might break a heck of a lot of dishes before it figures out something meaningful. And then, of course, there's the approach that people often use to build a simulator and train in simulation and try to run the simulated policy in the real world, but that is a pretty major barrier to emergence. It's very safe, you can test the policy in simulation, but someone has to build the simulator, and ultimately the biggest challenge is getting the simulator to reflect reality well enough, which might be more human learning than machine learning. And then you don't get this kind of interesting emergence because the only things that can emerge are the ones that you program into the simulator. To me, perhaps the biggest reason why simulation alone should not be enough is that if it was good enough, why didn't we train our vision, NLP, and speech models entirely in simulation? Well, in those settings we have a lot of data, and that's the other missing ingredient. The alternative to pure optimization is learning from data. And we've seen a lot of really impressive successes in machine learning in this area, especially in very recent years, where you take a large data set, a very large model, and typically a lot of GPUs in a data center, and maybe you train something with self-supervised data. Perhaps you have a small labeled data set for your task and a very large unlabeled data set that you scraped from the internet, perhaps text for a language model or images for an image generation model. And this can lead to some pretty impressive results. For example, it can lead to a system that can talk to you and tell you about jokes about cows going to Harvard, or explain a joke about TPU pods. It could also lead to a system that can generate pictures in response to textual prompts. We look at this and we're very impressed by it because this kind of generation looks very human-like to us. So what about learning from data and emergence? I talked before about how you get emergent behavior from optimization, but here this is seemingly all about data. So does this thing produce new stuff? Well, in some very literal sense, yes. Like, clearly a language model produces new text. It does not simply copy text from the internet. Image generation models clearly produce new images. They do not copy images from the internet. However, what makes these generations so impressive to us is that they look like something a person might produce. The pictures look like something a person might draw. The text looks like something a person would write. What makes Move 37 impressive to us is that no human being thought of it in the 2,500-year history of the game. They're both impressive, but in very different ways. And in some sense, the kind of emergence we get from optimization, to me at least, is much more exciting, because it shows that a machine could solve a problem differently than how a human could solve it, perhaps better. And I think that's the real promise of artificial intelligence, not merely to replace the role of humans for things that humans can already do well, but actually solve problems better in various dimensions. That, to me, is the essence of emergence, and that's something that we see from optimization, but we don't actually see that from these kinds of fully supervised approaches. And there's actually a reason for that. When we train these kinds of generation models on large amounts of internet data, we're employing some form of density estimation. The most classic one, if you're doing unsupervised learning, you're estimating the distribution of their data set. You're estimating P of X. And if you're doing that, of course, your data set matters a great deal. So the simple kind of density estimation that we learn about in statistics class looks like this. Clearly, what image generation or language models are doing is more sophisticated than that, but at some basic level, it's essentially similar. It's learning about the distribution of the data, and the process that gave rise to that distribution, if we're talking about, let's say, images on the internet, well, it's learning about what people who take pictures or draw pictures actually produce. So it makes a lot of sense that the kind of generations you get look like something that a person would produce, because that's literally what you're training the system to do. But in some very real sense, this is a little bit antithetical to emergence. You're not training it to produce unexpected solutions. In fact, you're doing very much the opposite. You're training it to produce the kind of solution that you might expect from a person. So what would it take for the emergence of new solutions in the real world? How could we get the best of optimization, finding solutions that go beyond what people would do, and the use of data, which could perhaps enable putting these things into the real world? Well, before we talk about this, I want to discuss an idea that I think has been around in the deep learning community for a very long time, but most recently was popularized in a short essay by Richard Sutton called The Bitter Lesson. This is an essay that has since become very widely known and widely read, although I would claim that many people slightly misunderstand it. So the short version of what this essay says is that if we want to build intelligent machines, we should think about methods that are simple and scalable rather than ones that encode our prior beliefs about how intelligence works. I think this first sentence sums it up very concisely. We have to learn the bitter lesson that building in how we think does not work in the long run. The two methods that seem to scale arbitrarily are learning and search. And in this essay, Richard Sutton advocates for approaching AI from the standpoint of building very general scalable methods that make ample use of computation. And he says that the two classes of methods that have proven to do this throughout history are learning and search. Now, I said that I believe that this essay is often misunderstood. Very often it's taken to mean roughly this, that we should just shovel more data into the GPUs, that we should do this, basically. And that is to some degree what the essay says, but it's a little more nuanced than that. And that's why we have to really unpack the second sentence. The two methods that seem to scale arbitrarily are learning and search. What does this mean? Well, learning is perhaps fairly straightforward. Learning is about using data to extract patterns. That's what those generative models do. They extract patterns, for example, that correlate how natural language prompts correspond to pictures, figure out those patterns, and then they're able to generate really nice pictures. Learning is about taking something from the world, taking data, and stuffing knowledge about that data into your model. In fact, in a very real sense, learning is literally stuffing knowledge about the world into your model, in that maximum likelihood training is compression. That is learning. But Richard Sutton doesn't say that you should just do learning. He says you should do learning and search. So what is search? This requires a little bit of interpretation, because the term search has a very technical meaning, particularly in context of reinforcement learning. Search doesn't mean web search. Search, roughly speaking, means using computation to extract inferences. Search is distinct from learning. Search is not about looking for patterns in data from the world. It's using what you found out about the world to perform inferences. Search is also a computational method, but insofar as learning pulls stuff from the world, search does not. Search kind of ruminates over what you've already pulled out. Search is basically optimization, some kind of iterative process that extracts inferences based on what you've learned to make rational decisions. So learning allows us to understand the world, and search leverages that understanding for emergence. Reinforcement learning is search. Planning, model predictive control, these are all search. Data without optimization doesn't allow us to solve new problems in new ways. It allows us to build machines that behave in ways analogous to how humans would behave, the humans that generated the data. Optimization without data is hard to apply to the real world outside of simulators. So we have both learning and search. I would claim that that is actually the ticket to effective emergence, to solving new problems in new ways, but in ways that actually work in the real world. Okay, now, of course, the best way we know how to instantiate search at scale these days for rational decision making is reinforcement learning. So can RL use data and optimization together? That's a somewhat complicated question. Reinforcement learning gives us two different things, and we have to separate these things in order to answer that question. First, reinforcement learning gives us a framework for learning-based decision making. We all understand what this means. Supervised learning goes from inputs to outputs, supervised by the ground truth outputs. Reinforcement learning goes from states to actions, not supervised by the ground truth actions, but supervised by some outcome of those actions, situated in a temporal process. So RL allows us to go from copying the data to making rational decisions to maximize utility. But RL is also another thing. It's a framework for active online learning for control. If we open up any reinforcement learning textbook, including, of course, Richard Sutton's famous textbook, we'll see a diagram that's roughly analogous to this, a circle. It's always a circle. It's an agent interacting with an environment in a continuous loop. That's very appealing because that's, of course, how we think about human and animal learning. Reinforcement learning emerged initially as a way to think about human and animal learning in psychology, and only later was adopted in computer science. This is the loop that I mentioned before. But this second thing can be very inconvenient for us because oftentimes in reality, we don't want to collect all of our data in the loop. So almost all real-world decision-making problems look like the thing on the left, but this active online thing makes it very difficult to scale to the real world. In the real world, we'd like to use large data sets. And if you have to collect the data set online through online interaction every time you train, that makes things very clunky. If you want to, for example, learn how to manipulate objects, and every time you have to retrain your model, you have to manipulate millions of objects in many real-world locations, this will be difficult to turn into a practical system. So RL can use data and optimization together, but we have to separate one and two to make that possible. So if we want data-driven reinforcement learning, what we really want is the ability to get rid of this cycle, not to get rid of online learning entirely, but just to make us less dependent on it, and instead instantiate an offline reinforcement learning framework where a reinforcement learning method can be given a large data set that was collected previously, perhaps from the internet, perhaps from autonomous agents interacting with the world, perhaps from chatbots talking to lots of humans, use it not just to copy the data, but to figure out how to do better than the data, how to optimize some utility, essentially to do search, and then from there potentially interact with the world some more and improve, maybe through additional online interaction. And that's what I'm going to discuss in this talk. So to give kind of a fanciful example that might make this a little more concrete, imagine that you would like to send a smart rover to Mars. How could you use this kind of combination of learning and search to solve this problem? Well, what you might do is you might start with a large data set. Maybe that data set would be collected by the Mars rover here on Earth, perhaps exploring analogous situations. It might be collected by other agents, maybe people pretending to be on Mars. This is actually a study that took place in Hawaii where people pretended to be on Mars for a year just to kind of find out what would happen. It might also come from other analogous experience that maybe is not directly connected to exploring Mars, but illustrates similar physical phenomena, like data of other vehicles driving over rough terrain, data of geologists analyzing rocks, the kind of things that a human astronaut would study if they wanted to prepare for a trip to Mars. And this could be used for learning and then for search. Discover the strategies based on this data that appear to work well in a variety of situations. Prepare the agent with a repertoire of behaviors that cover a broad range of situations using a combination of broad experience and optimization. And then the robot goes to Mars. And there it's going to continue to learn through online reinforcement learning, building on this basis of knowledge that it acquired to get better and better. And if some unexpected event takes place, if, for example, the Martian shows up, something that the robot did not prepare for in its prior experience, it already has this repertoire of skills to draw on. It already has generalizable representations and understanding of the world that it could use as a basis for some emergent solution. So reinforcement learning optimization would enable the emergent solution, but the capability to generalize that emergent solution to complex real-world environments would come from the ability to incorporate data. And then you could get a novel solution to a novel situation. Now, this is of course quite fanciful, and the kind of methods and techniques that would enable this kind of applications don't exist yet. But what I hope to tell you about today are the beginnings of research that I think could take us in this direction in the next few years. So I'll talk about the basics of offline RL. This won't be a very technical talk, so I'll keep this pretty high level. I'll discuss some examples of emergence in robotics, language and interaction, emergence with people, and a few quick notes about computational design. But let's start with the fundamentals of offline RL. So what do you expect offline RL methods to do, first of all? Well, one thing I will say is that offline RL is not just about copying the data, right? The whole point is that we want to actually perform learning and search together, learning and optimization. So a very common approach for data-driven learning-based control is called imitation learning. That's pretty much a supervised learning for control. You have some data, and you'd like to reproduce the behavior in that data. In learning-based control, we refer to this as imitation learning. Offline RL could do this, but it should be able to do a lot more. It's really about getting order from chaos. It's more like if you have data that looks like this, a variety of different behaviors, you examine those behaviors and figure out if bits and pieces of those behaviors could be recombined to solve some new task that maybe was not solved in the data. You could imagine this in a very simple case. If you've seen somebody go from A to B and you've seen them go from B to C, you ought to be able to figure out how to go from A to C. But of course, in reality, once you scale this up, the real promise is that you'll be doing this everywhere all at once. Imagine that you have a variety of human drivers that are all suboptimal in different ways. Maybe one driver knows how to merge really well. Another one knows how to navigate a stoplight really well. If you act as well as the best driver in every situation, then overall, you will be better than any one human driver. If you see many suboptimal behaviors and you put together the best parts of each one, you might get a much more optimal behavior out of your offline RL method. And that's really the promise of combining learning and search. So the workflow roughly would look like this. Collect the data set using any policy or mixture of policies. It could be humans performing the task, it could be an existing system, even random behaviors, or any combination of the above. And this is only done once. And then run offline RL on this data set to learn your policy. And you could think of it as basically the best policy you can pull out of the provided data. And then deploy that policy in the real world. And if you're not happy with how well it does, you can just modify your algorithm and go back to step 2, reusing all the same data. And of course, once you're done with that, and the robot actually goes to Mars, it can continue improving further through its own experience with online reinforcement learning from there. Okay, so that's basically the idea, but why is this a field of study? Like, why don't our RL algorithms already solve this? What's hard about offline RL? Well, the fundamental problem with offline RL is that it requires answering counterfactual queries. So imagine that you're doing this driving task. You've seen data from pretty decent human drivers. They're not perfect, but they'll generally stay on the road at least. During offline RL, the policy has to figure out, if it were to do an action differently from the action that was done in the data, would that be better or worse? Now, in many cases, you can actually answer that question. If you've seen a variety of different actions from different drivers, you can generalize and figure out that a similar action, maybe a little bit of this and a little bit of that, might be better than the one that was actually taken in that particular situation. But sometimes the action you're considering is so different than anything you've tried that there's simply no way to answer it using the data available to you. Now, we know that swerving off the road is a bad idea because we have a rich understanding of physics, but the model might not. So is this good or bad? And how do you know if you didn't see it in the data? So online RL algorithms don't have to handle this because they can simply try the action and see what happens. They'll actually drive off the road and crash and then figure out that that's bad. But if you're learning from data, you have to somehow account for these unseen or out of distribution actions, ideally in a safe way. Basically, you shouldn't do things for which you can't possibly know whether it's good or bad. But at the same time, you still have to make use of generalization to come up with behaviors that are better than the best things seen in the data. And that's a tension. You have to allow for generalization. You have to allow for things that are within the support of what you've seen, but better, but at the same time disallow the things for which you cannot be certain in your conclusion. And resolving that tension is very delicate because it really is a balance. Now, in this talk, I'm not going to go into all of the technical details of how offline RL is implemented in practice, but I will give you a brief summary of the kinds of approaches that people are exploring. There are several different methods, but the same kind of principles seem to be effective across the board. Use value-based methods, so these are methods that learn value functions or cube functions from off-policy data, and somehow address these unknowable actions, typically by disallowing them. One way to do this is to use the principle of pessimism or conservatism, like in conservative Q-learning, where the idea is that for actions that are too different from the data, we'll just teach the model those actions are bad. Basically teach the model to be pessimistic about the unknown. There are many methods that do this, but one widely known example is conservative Q-learning. Another idea is to impose a constraint, to say, well, do your best to model the world, but when you actually learn the policy, constrain that policy to deviate from the data by only a bounded amount. These are sometimes referred to as policy constraint methods, and there are a number of examples of these. And then there are some more exotic versions, which can sometimes work really well, that operate on different principles, like, for example, avoiding having unseen actions ever even participate in the learning process. That's what IQL, for example, does. So this requires a little bit of mathematical trickery, but it could actually be instantiated. There are other types of approaches too, but roughly speaking, they all have to contend with this challenge of counterfactual queries, typically by disallowing the method from doing something too different from what it could possibly generalize to. Okay, now that was the algorithms, but let's talk about actual emergence. And I'll talk about emergence in robotics, in language and interaction, and then at the end, a few quick notes about computational design. Now, emergence emerges at scale, so you need optimization, but if you're going to do this in the real world, you need scale. You need enough data so that you can cover enough interesting situations to discover new stuff. So if we're doing this in robotics, we need to get a lot of robot data or transfer knowledge from other sources. So when I started working on this problem at Google some time back, the way that we actually approached it is we actually set up many robots and we had them collect data to see what would happen. So you can think of this almost like a factory, only instead of building stuff, this factory collects data. And in this case, these robots are grasping different objects. Robots are great for studying emergence from data and optimization because they actually interact with the physical world. And the physical world is very complex, but of course you need a large enough breadth of experience to discover that complexity. So what happened when we collected data from many robots grasping objects? What did these kind of data-driven methods actually discover? Well, one thing that was kind of interesting to me is that the kind of patterns that they picked up on were not necessarily the ones that we would have expected as robotics researchers. So I'm going to show you a series of objects that are all kind of roughly the same size, they're all the same color, but they're going to be different in their physical properties. And first we have a few rigid objects, and the robot picks them up more or less exactly the way you'd expect. So for these objects, it puts the fingers on either side, closes the gripper, and picks it up. That's basically exactly what you would expect from a very standard heuristic grasping strategy. But now for this next object, after the eraser, we have a soft sponge. And the robot actually pinches it in the middle, and this behavior is actually consistent Why? Well, because for soft materials, pinching is a much more effective strategy to pick it up. And interestingly, material properties were picked up on by the model earlier in training than more intricate geometric properties. We typically think of grasping as a geometry problem, but here it was much more about material identification. This is a small flat object where the robot actually spends a bit of time positioning the fingers because you have to have them very flat against the table. So this is, perhaps another emergent behavior. It's always difficult to tease this apart, of course, because you don't know if the system is doing this intentionally or due to some pattern. In fact, the very question of intentionality is actually kind of murky when it comes to these data-driven methods. But it does appear to do something pretty smart in many cases. Here's a heavily upgraded version of this system. This one used a more sophisticated reinforcement learning approach, and you can see that there's some emergent singulation behavior where it pulls apart the individual pieces of this puzzle before grasping each of them in turn and depositing them in the bin. If we fast forward a little bit, here we're going to also have a more adversarial setting. We're going to have it pick up some object, and a person will actually come in and knock it out of the gripper, and it has an emergent recovery. So if it gets knocked out of the gripper, it can try to correct itself. Sometimes it picks up an object directly on the first attempt, and sometimes it needs to try several times. And again, it actually keeps an eye on the object, so even though it never saw the object get pushed out of the gripper, the fact that it learned in a variety of situations gets it to be robust to this kind of thing. So what have we done, and what questions remain open? Well, we've seen that large amounts of data can be used by robots to discern patterns in the real world, and this allows them to understand physical properties of objects and discover skills like singulation. But of course, so far, the kind of skills we can discover are relatively simple. Partly they're simple because our data is simple. If we want to collect autonomous data fully autonomously from scratch, then we'll be limited to these simple behaviors. If we want more longer-term things, then we need to build that up either through examples from humans or hierarchy. And that is something that we're working on, but the kind of data used really matters, and it's actually a pretty big open question as to how to do this kind of research at scale with more complex skills. But it's exciting to see how we can bootstrap towards more complex skills in the future. What I want to talk about next is actually much more recent work that studies emergence through learning and optimization, not in robotics, but actually in interactions with people. And that's, of course, another very rich area for these kinds of techniques. Here's an example of a task you might consider. Let's say that you have a dialogue agent. This is an example of a dialogue benchmark. It's a visual dialogue. So there's a questioner and an answerer. The answerer has a particular picture in mind. The questioner has to ask them questions and then guess which picture it was. It's kind of like a game of 20 questions. Here's an example of one of these dialogues. Well, if we wanted to use these principles of offline RL, what we would need is a large data set of dialogues. And fortunately for human interaction, it's not too bad to get this because you can just take data of humans talking to other humans. So it might be very difficult to have an RL algorithm learn entirely by talking to people. That might take a really long time. But getting data of people talking to people, or more generally interacting with people, is comparatively much easier. So we're going to take a pre-trained language model, and we're going to fine-tune it with offline RL on data of humans talking to other humans. That data is easy to get, and it provides an easy way to get started. And of course, offline RL can then take this data and can train the agent for a variety of downstream goals. And what we're going to explore is how combining learning and search, learning and optimization actually allows us to accomplish a variety of goals with the same exact data. So the basic idea for the method, this is implicit language queue learning. It's similar to the offline algorithm IQL, although it also incorporates elements of CQL, and it's adapted to train large language models. Think of these as like kind of GPT-J style models. And the way that it does this is by taking a pre-trained model just on regular internet data, and then fine-tuning a behavior policy and a value function. And the value function, basically every token's logit is replaced by that token's value function. So it's really literally a per token value function. And then at test time, you can sample tokens, score their Q values, and then take the one with the largest value. So let's look at what this does on this visual dialogue task. If we just give it the standard reward function, the questioner here is the bot, it'll kind of ask reasonable questions about the image at hand. But we can also change this up. We could, for example, give it a reward function that penalizes questions that lead to yes or no answers. So we're not punishing the bot for saying yes or no, we're punishing the bot for asking the sort of questions that will cause a person to say yes or no. And we're going to use the same exact data, so we didn't change anything about the data set here. And immediately we get a very different behavior. It starts saying, what color is the kite? Is the person male or female? What is the person wearing? We can take this idea even further. We can have an even more harsh penalty for any uninformative answer. So there's basically a template-based way of defining that. And now it starts asking quantitative questions. How many buses? What color are the buses? And so on. So this shows how the interplay of learning and optimization actually leads to different behaviors that optimize different objectives using the same data. And that's in stark contrast to a supervised learning approach that would simply copy the behavior in the data. Okay, but so far, maybe these behaviors are not that interesting. They're kind of what we would expect. Let's look at another scenario where we're also going to interact with humans, but not with language, rather in a kind of video game setting where we have to non-verbally influence them. So the simulator here is based on some work in Professor Anka Dragan's group at UC Berkeley. Professor Dragan and her students developed kind of a simplified version of the video game Overcooked, where there are two players that play together, and they're supposed to collaborate to cook dishes. So they're going to take the tomatoes and the onions, put them in the pots, put them on the dishes, and serve them to the delivery area. And the person with a green hat is going to be controlled by the bot, and the blue hat will be controlled by a person. But when we collect data, the data is just collected of people playing with other people. So just like in dialogue, we're going to collect data of humans playing with each other, and then we'll control the person with the green hat, and then the blue hat will be a human being. And then at test time, there's a catch. At test time, the tomato soup is worth much more than the onion soup, but the human doesn't know this. So the bot knows it, and the bot essentially has to influence the human. So the bot's reward function tells it that tomatoes are worth more, just like the dialogue bot before had a reward that said avoid yes or no questions. So can offline RL influence humans to get them to play better? What I'm going to describe is a paper by Joey Hong, who's a PhD student, co-advised by myself and Professor Dragan. In this setup, when humans play with each other, they accidentally influence each other during normal play. And they sometimes make one type of soup and sometimes another. Now, during normal play, humans don't care what kind of soup they make. They're rewarded the same way for each one, but just accidentally they'll do one or the other. They'll also influence each other accidentally because if one player is good at something, bad at another thing, the other player will naturally try to compensate. So perhaps by analyzing lots of games of humans playing with humans, we can figure out what sorts of behaviors lead the other player to do one thing or another. And this is why offline RL can actually figure out these influence strategies. So here's the first scenario, direct physical influence. Remember, the green hat, that's the bot. The blue hat, that's a person. And this is an actual user study. So notice what's going on here. There's some onions, there's some tomatoes. The blue hat, the human, doesn't know whether it should make onion soup or tomato soup. It thinks that both soups are equally good. The green hat knows this. The green hat knows that it should be tomatoes, and they're supposed to non-verbally influence the blue hat to avoid the onions. Here's what happens if we run a naive baseline. This is a supervised learning baseline that basically copies the data. You can see that the green hat goes to get the tomatoes, the blue hat puts in some onions, and they end up with a lot of onions in their soup. Okay? Now let's look at the offline RL agent. Now here, green hat wants to influence blue hat to avoid the onions. What does he do? Well, it might not be obvious at first, right? They kind of are doing similar things, and yet they end up with only tomatoes in the pots. Why is that? Well, watch carefully what the green hat does when the blue hat approaches the pot. You see, the green hat kind of hangs around near the pot, blocking the onions, as long as blue hat is near it. You see, every time the blue hat is near there, every time the blue hat is in a position where they could step onto that square next to the onions, the green hat is going to wait just 1 minute longer, just a little longer to avoid allowing blue hat into that spot. Unless there are already 2 tomatoes in the pot and blue hat is holding a tomato, in which case it's safe to let them go there. So green hat basically figured out an influence strategy. Now you could say that in this case maybe this is not so interesting because, well, in some sense, green hat is not really reasoning about blue's intentions. It's actually doing kind of a worst case thing. Basically, it's making sure that no matter what blue does, they're simply physically incapable of doing the suboptimal thing. So we set up a more nuanced strategy. This one is not about tomatoes and onions anymore. Here, the strategic element is a little different. Here, you'll notice that blue hat has some plates that are close to the pot. Green hat's plates are far away. So the optimal strategy here, whether they're making onions or tomatoes, is to let blue hat pick up the plate and have the green hat put the soup on that plate and dump it into their deposit area. That way, neither of them have to go more than 2 squares away from the pot. So if the players play naively through supervised learning, you can see that here, blue hat picks up the plate and has to carry that plate all the way to their deposit area, which is far away. It would have been more optimal for them to hand the plate to green, have them plate the soup, and deposit in their deposit area, which is much closer. So now let's see what happens with the offline RL bot. And again, this is kind of subtle. They make the soup, and then green hat puts that plate on the counter. And you'll notice that green hat doesn't try to plate the soup. In fact, blue hat for a minute there hesitates, and green hat is just standing there waiting. Green hat could have picked up the plate and plated the soup themselves instead of waiting, but they're intentionally going to wait because they know that if they wait, eventually blue hat will get the idea, grab that plate, and do the more optimal thing. So in the short term, it's actually worse. In the short term, it would have been better for green to just go for it. But in the long term, blue gets the idea and starts doing the more optimal behavior. Now, this is clearly influencing because this is actually doing something that relies on blue responding to it appropriately. Okay, so what have we done and what remains open? Well, we showed that offline RL can learn from humans interacting with other humans. And this can be used to train language models to achieve goals, as well as to influence humans in video games. The evaluations are still at a small scale. The big benefit of large language models and other models that leverage human-human data is that they can pick up on subtle patterns in behavior. And that, of course, requires large amounts of data and very subtle influence, which we haven't yet demonstrated. So it remains to be seen in the future how far influence via offline RL can go, but the initial results seem very promising. So much so that it might make sense to actually start thinking about also ways to quantify things like deception and manipulation in these cases, which we're also working on actively. Okay, the last topic I'm going to talk about is maybe the one that is the most half-baked. I don't have results on real data here, but hopefully this can also give you some sense for how data and computation in concert could lead to some interesting emergence. So far I talked entirely about sequential processes, but of course you can use learning and optimization not just in sequential settings, but also for problems in science and engineering that involve design. Let's say that you have a data set of past experiments you've done testing the efficacy of some drug. Maybe you've tested a variety of different drugs, and for each one you have a score at how well it performs in your experiment. Could you take this data set, train some kind of model on it, and synthesize a better drug? This is basically the same challenge as offline RL, right? Because in offline RL, you took data of states and actions and figured out better actions. Here we take data of drugs and their efficacies and figure out a better drug. In fact, similar problems apply. You might not want to synthesize a drug that's too different from anything in your data because you would not be able to accurately predict its efficacy. So you have to somehow generalize. You have to find a new drug different from any one drug in your data set, but restrict your generalization only to things for which you might have a confident conclusion. And in fact, we've developed algorithms for this problem, which we refer to as offline model-based optimization, based on the same principles as offline RL, principles like pessimism. And we've shown on simpler benchmark tasks that this can be used for things like optimizing robot morphologies, molecules, proteins, and DNA sequences. And we've actually applied these techniques to optimize the parameters of hardware accelerators to get microchips that are faster at running certain kinds of workloads like certain types of neural nets. And this is work done at Google. It's a method called Prime that optimizes the latency of chips and actually generalizes to new kinds of workloads. But what I want to show you today is some work that's currently in progress. This is work done together with Professor Grace Gu at UC Berkeley, her student Eileen Chen, and the students Xinyang Yang and Avril Kumar, studying how this kind of model-based optimization can be used for material design. Now, I will preface this by saying that this work uses simulated data. In principle, this could use data from real experiments, but so far, these experiments are still in simulation. So I am kind of contradicting myself because I made a big deal out of going beyond simulation. These are preliminary results, but hopefully they'll give you some idea for where these kinds of things could go. So the task here is to design a composite material. In this composite material, there is stiff materials shown in yellow and softer materials shown in blue. And you want to use limited amounts of each one, so you can just make everything stiff. And the goal is to make a material that will maximally resist impact. So here there's this little simulated bullet, and this is a hand-designed material, and you can see what happens. It kind of punches through, and then it's supposed to be stopped, or at least slowed down as much as possible. So the hand-designed material is, kind of more or less what you'd expect. Now let's run optimization. Just like before, we're going to have a data set of different materials. These are actually randomly generated. We'll try them. And then we'll run optimization on this data set with a method that is essentially like conservative Q-learning, but for MBO. It's called conservative objective models. And here is the first material it comes up with. It's a little crazy, but if we run the simulation, we can see that it actually does a little bit better. The bullet still goes through, but it slows down a lot more. If we run further rounds of optimization, we start seeing some patterns emerge. We start seeing this diagonal up and down pattern. And then when we simulate the bullet, you can see that it actually slows down a lot more, and actually the sides of the material bend in this interesting way that almost like catches the bullet. It actually kind of doesn't just slow it down, but it actually closes in around it. That's a very interesting emergent behavior that basically comes through because of optimization. Now again, this is still in simulation. It remains to be seen the degree to which these kinds of methods can work well on real-world experimental data, but I think the initial results are quite promising. So we can frame computational design problems and discovery problems analogously to offline RL. Similar algorithmic ideas can be used to derive working methods, and these methods seem to lead to emergent designs. But the most promising results, I think, still use simulated data, and it's exciting to see where this will go. And I should mention, of course, that we're by no means the only ones working on this kind of work on computational design. There are many other labs engaged in this. An example of very recent work, this is from Professor David Baker's lab at University of Washington, uses computational design to design very elaborate protein complexes. I think this kind of direction is really exciting. There's a lot of applications of modern generative modeling techniques here, and of course, a lot still remains to be done. But just to conclude, I want to come back to this point about learning and search. And if there's sort of one thing to take away from this talk, it's that data without optimization doesn't allow us to solve new problems in new ways. And optimization without data is hard to apply to the real world outside of simulators. So if we can combine data and optimization, then we could see powerful emergent behaviors in real world settings. Offline RL in some ways is one way to instantiate this concept. There may be many others. The high order bit, I think, is to use learning and search, data and optimization. And perhaps then we could get robots that learn from data on Earth, go to Mars, and interact in novel ways with novel creatures. Thank you very much for listening.